This panel will open by Noah Keuzenkamp, who is from organization Transgender Europe. And Noah will introduce or will tell us some brief introduction, overview of law in European countries. Then will follow Leo Yannick Wild. Leo is from Germany, and he will tell us something about German specificities of German legislation. And the last one is Romy Kolárik from organization Transfuzia from Slovakia, and he will tell us something about Slovakian framework. And after these three presentations, there will be Barbara Havelková. She's from Oxford University, and she participated in a new publication which was published a few weeks last year. And it's about situation of trans people and law in Europe. So she will some kind of wrap up the presentations, and she will tell us something about the new publication. So first of all, I would like to ask Noah to tell us his presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for staying until the last panel. We really appreciate it. So I was asked today to talk about the European and the human rights perspective. So I will first talk very briefly about my organization, for those of you who don't know Transgender Europe, and then I will talk about legal gender recognition in more detail, about the reality in Europe as we have it today, the human rights standards, and how to actually reform your current legislation so that it conforms to human rights. And we will talk a bit about some good and best practice that we have in Europe. And then I will very briefly also talk about healthcare, about human rights standards and best practice. And I hope it will tie in quite nicely to some of the discussions we've had today, to say, because now we've heard a lot about the realities in the Czech Republic and the different opinions about whether this actually helps the community or not. And I will talk about what human rights law says about that, and we will see that there's quite some discrepancy between human rights law and how it is in the Czech Republic today. So Transgender Europe is an umbrella body of trans organizations and trans activists all across the continent. We were founded 10 years ago, and we now have 100 member organizations in 40 countries, including in the Czech Republic Transparent and Transfusion, for example, so we have been working with them. And we have 11 staff members based in Berlin. We work for the equality and human rights of trans people. And to that effect, we do advocacy with national governments, with international bodies such as the Council of Europe or the European Union. But we also do capacity building, so we support our member organizations in their work, in what they are doing. And we do monitoring and research on the situation of trans people across Europe. And we do awareness building, awareness raising with the general public, stakeholders, policymakers. We have been working on legal gender recognition almost from the beginning of our organization. And I think I don't have to explain again why legal gender recognition is that important, because in the last panel we had really detailed discussions about why it's important. But from a human rights perspective, what's important to add is that we have from the European Court of Human Rights and from the European Convention of Human Rights clearly spelled out that access to legal gender recognition is a human right. It concerns the right to private life. So for example, we have the judgment of Goodman versus UK saying that all European states have to allow legal gender recognition. And in a survey across the EU, for example, 3/4 of trans people said that they would have a much more comfortable life if the legal gender recognition procedures in their country were easier. And take into account that all the people asked, some of them already had some quite easy procedures, but overall people felt it would be even better if it was easier. And interestingly also, if you ask people in general, the font is a bit small, this is a survey across the EU of everyone, not just trans people, also cis people. Do you think that trans people or transsexual people should be allowed to change their documents? And you see that the majority, the dark blue and the light blue, say, yes, I think they should be able to change their documents. So we're also getting a majority opinion, really, of people thinking that this is an important issue and it should be possible to change a document. But unfortunately the reality doesn't look that good at the moment. So if we look at all countries across Europe, we still have a compulsory diagnosis or expert opinion in all countries except 3. We still have compulsory medical treatment such as hormones or surgeries in 31 countries, compulsory sterilization in 24 countries, 13 in the EU, compulsory divorce in 22 countries, and no legislation in 8 countries. And the result of that, and I will talk a bit more about that in detail, is the pathologization of trans people, so that trans people are still considered to be mentally ill in many countries, that they face a very complicated, long and expensive procedure. We've also heard about that from the Czech Republic. That's not uncommon in other countries too, that it can take several years. You have to hire a lawyer, you have to go to court, you have to get expert testimonies. It's very long and complicated. And it really doesn't reflect the reality that trans people are very diverse. And some of them, for example, want hormones, some of them want hormones and surgery, some of them want neither of those. So any solution that prescribes any of these measures is a violation of human rights. I will go into that in more detail. So to raise awareness about the situation, we publish this map every year. There are lots of copies outside, so please pick one up. On the front, you can see which countries still require sterilization, which countries don't have legislation, and the blue ones, they're not, in the morning it was said, oh, the blue ones, they have great legislation. That's not quite true. The blue ones don't require sterilization, but they still may require other things that are a violation of human rights. And if you turn this to the back, you see in really great detail, okay, which country requires what, which country has hate crime protection, which country requires a diagnosis in legal gender recognition. So please pick up a copy of the map if you're interested in exploring the situation in a bit more detail. And so when we look at this is the reality, but when we look at the developing language in the human rights framework, then we have this excellent document from last year, a resolution from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which really sets the standards for legal gender recognition in Europe. And in this resolution, the Council of Europe asks all member states to develop quick, transparent and accessible procedures based on self-determination for changing the name and registered sex. Self-determination meaning based only on the completely free decision of the trans person, with no requirements or no test or diagnosis or expert opinion. And this resolution also says that all member states of the Council of Europe should abolish sterilization and other compulsory medical treatment, including a diagnosis, as a necessary legal requirement to recognize a person's gender identity, and remove any restrictions to remain in an existing marriage. So it's really clear language, and it really clearly spells out that if you do have a diagnosis or a sterilization or divorce requirement, you are violating international human rights standards by doing so. So what does this mean in practice? How can you draft a new gender recognition law that actually complies with human rights? To do so, I think there are 3 dimensions to take into account. One is the requirements, the other one is the procedure for actually changing it, and the 3 is the effect after you changed it. So let me give some details about that. Mainly we have talked about requirements. So to comply with human rights law, you have to remove all compulsory requirements, especially medical requirements such as sterilization, hormonal interventions, diagnosis, or even mandatory counseling, even if no diagnosis comes out of it. To force a trans person to talk to a psychiatrist is a human rights violation in the context of legal gender recognition. The real life test, divorce. All of that human rights language is very clear. It's not conforming to human rights. Because the key point is that any requirement you ask for in legal gender recognition should not create a dilemma between different human rights. Because on the one hand, every person has the right to legal recognition and private life. That's a human right, private life, guaranteed to all people in Europe. And you also have the right to have a family, to reproduce, to have bodily integrity. That means to freely decide over what you do with your body. And to be free from inhumane and degrading treatment. And both the Council of Europe as well as the UN have repeatedly said that forcing someone to sterilization is a violation of, is a violation of the freedom from inhumane and degrading treatment. So basically you can only uphold human rights in legal gender recognition if there's a complete separation between the legal process and the access to medical treatment and healthcare. The second aspect to look at is the actual procedure, so how you go about to change your documents. And there's also strong language from the Council of Europe that asks that the procedure is quick, transparent and accessible. So for example, in Portugal it takes 8 days. The government has to respond within 8 days and change your name and gender marker within 8 days of your application. The procedure should be transparent, so there has to be somewhere a very clear and simple description that every trans person can follow, and it has to also describe very clearly where do I have to go, who do I have to hand in the application to. And it should be accessible, so ideally it is free, such as is the case in Argentina and Denmark. There should be no degrading processes, so no asking intrusive questions. Even if you have to hand in an application, you could imagine a system where people hand in just the application, but then they still have to answer questions that some government official is asking you. That would be a degrading process. And there should be no need to hire a lawyer, because that would not be very accessible. To most people, hiring a lawyer, going to court, it's a very unfamiliar procedure that represents a huge barrier. It costs money, you have to inform yourself, it's very complex. So that would also not be in conforming with human rights law. And the third dimension to look at is the effect. So what happens after you change your name and your gender marker? Here the key aspect is a disclosure ban. That means that the law should specify that documents are changed without a trace, so that no third party can find out that this took place. Because again, this is about respecting trans people's privacy and their right to either out themselves or not out themselves if they don't want to. And trans people should have full access to all rights that any other person would as well have, such as marriage. And there should be an obligation of, for example, employers or universities or schools to reissue any transcripts or documents that a person needs in their new name and new gender marker. So, in revising, for example, the Czech legislation, our suggestion would be to really look at these three dimensions: the requirements, making sure there's a separation and it's based on self-determination, the procedure, and then the actual effects. And in a way, the good thing about human rights compliant legislation is that the law becomes quite simple and cost effective, because it's based only on the self-determination of the person. So there's no need for the involvement of various experts, committees meeting, and so on and so forth, lawyers, court costs. You simply have an application process, and I will talk about how this works in Denmark and Malta in a second. And separately from that, you regulate healthcare in a separate law or a separate guideline. You make sure that trans people still have access to healthcare. And again, this is important because trans people are very diverse and they all have different needs. So their healthcare needs are very diverse and they should not be linked to a legal need. And I'm not going to go through the detail, you can have a look at the slide. Based on that, there are a number of key concerns in the Czech Republic, which we talked about today, from sterilization to diagnosis to the real-life test, to the fact that it's not quick, because it takes at least 1.5 to 2 years, if not even more years, to go through the whole process. And there's the gatekeeping around the name requirement. So there's a huge range of issues that would currently not be compliant with human rights. And it was also mentioned that together with Transfusion and Proud, my organization and ILGA Europe filed a complaint under the European Social Charter. This complaint is accessible online, so everybody can have a look at what we are arguing and what the government replied. And we are quite hopeful, actually, that the decision will go in our favor, because we just had this decision from Sweden as well, from last week, where Sweden announced that they would financially compensate all trans people who were forced to undergo sterilization as a requirement for legal gender recognition. Because they had this effect, they had this law until 2013, where sterilization was required, and trans people sued the government saying this is a violation of human rights. And there now was a decision by the court in 2012 that this is correct, that Sweden was violating the human rights of trans people. So they now announced that they will financially compensate every trans person who had to undergo sterilization. So we see that there is this development, and that this may also be the case in the Czech Republic one day, that trans people actually sue the government and they will get compensation for how the situation is today. So how to do it better? What are some of the good and best practices that we have in Europe? The first country leading the way was Denmark in 2014. They introduced a law based solely on self-determination of the applicant. So no requirements, no medical requirement, no divorce requirement. You simply submit a request, a letter to the civil registry stating what you want your new name and your gender marker to be. There even is an X option available, so you can have a gender marker F for female, M for male, or X for undefined, or I have another gender. So that's really positive. There's still a little bit of room for improvement, which is why we call it good practice and not best practice. It's not available for people under 18, and we know that especially young people in schools or transitioning from school to university face a lot of harassment and discrimination, or going from school to an apprenticeship or a job. So there it's actually particularly important that they can change their gender marker. And there's a waiting period of 6 months, which means it's not very quick. So we would also argue that this is too long. I was saying in comparison Portugal is 8 days, so this is more what we should be looking at. And in 2015, Malta implemented a law on gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And this law we consider best practice also because it's actually a separate legal text that has very positive language about trans people. So the law says, for example, that all people have the right to recognition of their gender identity, to the free development of their person according to their gender identity, to be always treated according to their gender identity and to be identified in documents correctly, and that they have the right to bodily integrity and physical autonomy. So this is very strong, very positive language that you now have in the law, really recognizing this is every person's right. And again, similar to the Danish law, there are no requirements, it's based on self-determination. There is also access for people under 18 in Malta. There's no waiting period, 15 days, and the whole process is done. There's a ban on disclosing that it took place, so people can protect their privacy. The law even talks about rectified gender, so that means corrected gender. So the law says, we will correct your gender, saying we know it was wrong before, now it will be correct. So I think that's really positive phrasing. And the law also sets out that separately from the legal process, a new medical protocol has to be developed, and for that purpose a commission was set up with human rights experts and medical and psychosocial experts working together on making sure that trans people still have access to healthcare and that it's funded through public healthcare. And in 2015, we also had a change in Ireland to a very good law. You see here the first 2 people in Ireland who got their gender recognition certificate. It's again based on self-determination, similar to the Danish and the Maltese model. You basically have this very short application form, 2 pages. You fill it in. You can even say how you want to be addressed, Mr., Mrs., Miss, or other. You can say whatever preferred address you would like to have, your name, your gender marker, you hand it in, done. So that's really how it should be done, a simple process. And maybe just briefly, when we work with policymakers across Europe, we sometimes come again the same myths or ideas or concerns why policymakers don't want to make the law simple. So I will just address a few of them. So one concern we sometimes hear is that people say, well, we're worried to make it easy because then maybe sex offenders use the procedure to change their name and their gender marker, and then they have access to women's facilities or spaces or bathrooms or prisons. But I think that this completely disregards that the social cost of changing your documents is very high, because if you do that, you then run into the problems every day that trans people run into. There's also simply no evidence from anywhere that this has ever happened. When the Dutch government changed the law, they even commissioned a study to look into this. Is this possible that sex offenders or people who want to commit fraud would abuse the law? And they found no, there is no concern. And we have several countries where the laws are really easy, and we have never come across a case of anyone doing this. And if it happened, it's simply an abuse of the law, and it can be prosecuted. Because that's not the intention of the law. There's this concern about people will start switching their gender back and forth if you make it easy. But actually, if you look at statistics, the vast majority of trans people never transition back. Once they make the decision to transition, they stick with it. It's over 95% of people. And those very few people who transition back usually do it because it can also lead to a lot of discrimination. Your family might cut your ties, so you might decide, okay, that's too hard for me, I'm going to change my life again. But it's very rare. And even if it's the case, the laws such as the Danish law or the Irish law, they have a very simple administrative procedure that you can change back your gender marker if at some point in your life you decide that actually your gender identity has changed. So we don't see why it necessarily has to be a problem. It wouldn't create any costs, and it would not be used very often. Then we have this myth, which today I think was really a lot about this myth. So whether a person is really trans can only be assessed by an expert. But actually, if you look, for example, at the standards of care by WPATH, WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare, and they agree that the state-of-the-art expert approach, so the best approach, is simply to respect a person's self-determination. If they tell you they are trans, then to respect that. And they also agree that there's no objective assessment possible to determine anyone's gender identity. So I was actually just checking the statistics again. For example, WPATH, also under 10% of the experts on that body think that there should still be a mental health diagnosis for trans people, under 10%. So it's really, they agree that you respect a person's self-determination and no need for diagnosis or test or assessment. And we have a resource that addresses even more myths and has a checklist when you're developing the law that goes into a lot of detail. What to do about people who are refugees, how can they get access, what about people in prison. So you can consult this checklist, and later this year we will also reissue this publication on legal gender recognition and the checklist for developing legislation. It was, I think, our most popular publication ever, so we've run out of copies, so there will be a new one. And now very briefly on human rights and best practice on healthcare, separately from the whole legal dimension, which is just about changing your name and gender. The same resolution that I talked about before, so the same document from the Council of Europe, also talks about healthcare. And it also says that all states in Europe should make gender reassignment procedures such as hormone treatment, surgery and psychological support accessible for trans people, and ensure that they are all reimbursed by public health insurance schemes. It also encourages all countries to explore alternative trans healthcare models based on informed consent. I will go into more detail about what that means in a moment. And it asks that trans people are not labeled as mentally ill. So it asks all countries to change their national classifications and to advocate on the international level for the ICD and the DSM, for these international manuals to be changed as well. So very clear language. And we also talked a lot about consent today. And for example, in the government response to the collective complaint that we launched, they said, well, but there was consent, everybody agreed, no one was forced. So it's not free consent if another of your human rights depends on you saying yes. So that's not consent, because you're asking a person to choose between one human right, the human right to health, for example, and the human right to privacy. So, and for example, if you look at another human rights document on coerced sterilization from 2013, it also says that consent can be invalid if the victim has been misinformed, intimidated, or manipulated with financial or other incentives, such as, if you say yes, we will change your document. If you say no, we will not change your document. That's an incentive to say yes, to give consent. So therefore it would not be considered free and informed consent. You can also look at the UN Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, where it says, consent means that you can always withdraw. Consent may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without any disadvantage. But if you're a trans person in the Czech Republic and you consent to, let's say, sterilization or surgery, and then you withdraw your consent, it has consequences, it has a disadvantage, because it means you can then not change your documents anymore. So, in terms of healthcare and informed consent models, what that would mean in reality is that you provide healthcare, including hormone treatment, in an easy and accessible way without requiring a diagnosis or any meeting with a psychiatrist. This is already happening in community clinics in the US, for example, where you go, you get informed about, okay, hormones, you would have to take them like this, the cost would be this would be the effect, this is the risk, but you are not diagnosed and you are not assessed or tested in any way. It would be based on the self-determination of trans people. It would not have a one-size-fits-all approach. So for example, we also heard today that in the Czech Republic, the way it goes is you get diagnosed, then you have a real-life test, hormones, surgery. But that's a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to go A, B, C, D. An informed consent model would mean that someone can say, I want top surgery, but I do not want hormones. And that would be acceptable under this model, because every trans person has individual needs. Not everyone needs hormones, not everyone needs surgeries. So you respect the right of the individual to make an educated decision, and you provide a choice of informed professionals, so you can consult with different professionals and get their opinion, for example, on the risk of a specific surgery. And like I said before, there's no incentive to obtain consent, and there's no negative consequence to withdraw consent. So the best practice for providing healthcare for trans people means that on the one hand you provide discrimination-free access to general healthcare. Trans people also get flus, so they also need to be able to go to a GP to just get flu medication without being discriminated. But you also provide discrimination-free access to trans-specific healthcare based on self-determination, informed consent, individualized treatment options and durations, and no diagnosis of mental illness. And maybe some of you have heard 2 days ago Denmark announced that they're now the first European country to no longer use any diagnosis of mental illness for trans people. And the government was even quoted as saying that they're feeling very annoyed that it's taking so long at the international level to change this, and they will just go ahead unilaterally and change it in Denmark. And of course, to ensure the cost coverage of all medically necessary treatment. So that's basically the summary from a human rights perspective.